Hey you guys, welcome back to session 2 of the Rooster series. We're going to paint the fun part, the tail. So get your brushes ready and we're gonna have a really good time. Okay, so we're gonna do my favorite part of the painting, and I was so happy with how it turned out. So this is like the best part of the video, I think. But anyway, okay. So what I'm doing is I'm going in with my Alvaro Castagnet brush with a lot of water and just putting in strokes in the direction of the feathers. I'm not being exact, but I'm covering a lot of the tail with water, but not all of the tail, because I want to leave a few little crisp edges of white to delineate between some of the feathers and just add some life with the whites of the paper. So I'm painting with a very soft, with a very fast brush stroke for some of these feathers, but also at the same time being very careful and thinking a lot. And the colors that I'm using here include ultramarine blue, permanent green light, and phthalo blue. And there you can see at the tip I put in some permanent green light. And then in the middle kind of is that phthalo, and then at the top of the feather there is ultramarine. And I'm just going in and making some bold strokes and trying not to overpaint it and keep it loose. And you can see where some of those bold strokes are feathering out into the clear water that I put down first, putting in some splashes to really add some dynamic movement in the painting. And I'm just getting comfortable. And okay, there's that big brush stroke of Windsor Violet, and you can see how I'm letting a lot of these feathers melt in together, because I really wanted them to look really poetic and like they had a lot of movement, because as you imagine, a rooster's tail does have a lot of movement in it. I'm also trying to use some calligraphic strokes where there's thicker parts of the line and then there's thinner areas. I'm going in with the very tip of my brush there and putting in some tiny little thin lines, just so I have some thick lines and some thin lines, and some of the thick lines and in the thin area, and keeping the colors on each brush stroke different, as you can see, being really careful to do that, putting in some splashes as I go, just having a lot of fun, but also still really thinking hard about what I'm doing. And then I'm going in with some light tea consistency paint around the periphery of the tail too, to be able to kind of meld and melt some of the tail into the background and into the base of the tail too. I'm trying to attach it to the bird so that it doesn't look like it's a pasted on beautiful tail and the rest of the bird is stiff. You don't want that. So you want to paint this all together. And that's why you might want to do my little mapping out thing with very light tea consistency, so you can see where you want your basic whites and your basic darks to go before you go in and try to do these fast, more gestural strokes that do need to be done as quickly as possible while everything is wet. See, that's almost too wet of a puddle, that little ultramarine puddle I put down there that curves the other way. So I'll probably wring out my brush a little bit and sop some up. Yep, that's what I did. It was too I don't want it too puddly, because then it'll leave really hard edges. And then I put in a little bit of permanent green light. I did another permanent green light feather there, and then I'm going along the edge with some darker paint and just trying to keep each brush stroke really dynamic and different. Each brush stroke adds something different than the previous brush stroke. just because this tail is so dynamic. There's so many colors in it. There's so much movement. So you want to mimic that with the way you paint it. It can be really fun, and don't put too much pressure on yourself. And I'm going in with some sweeps of phthalo blue, about milk consistency phthalo blue. See, I've got clear water in my brush, and I swished through the top of the tail, just kind of melted all together. And then there's this really pretty negative space here. It's like a V negative space here between the base of the tail and the body of the bird. And I just really wanted to play that up. So I'm going to make that little V negative shape really pretty dark so that it accentuates the shape of the tail going up, and it accentuates the back of the bird going up this way because it's just such a beautiful negative space, and I want to give it a lot of love. So that's why I painted it that beautiful bright phthalo blue, because I really want that to be a highlight area too, because it's a very pretty shape. It's not boring. And then I'm just pulling down some of that color down into the bird so it doesn't look pasted on. And I'm painting some of these little rivulets of feathers that are very soft and subtle throughout the bird, just with different colors: Windsor violet, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, and just varying that what's on my brush just to keep it really dynamic. Going in with some clear water down under the feathers of the tail feathers. I'm trying to keep them gestural, not look like worms, but be more calligraphic where there's thin areas and thick areas. I could have done better. I could have done better right there. They look like worms. I'll fix it though. Anyway, so then just to make sure it stayed loose and beautiful, I sprayed the tail with water. I know it was a risk because it was so pretty, but I just wanted to make sure it was loose. So you can see I'm spraying into that tail. I'm being painterly, y'all. I'm spraying water into that tail to loosen it up even more. And that's a great way to loosen up the painting, is just when it's a little bit wet or kind of really wet. In this case, just spray it and it'll loosen it up even more. Okay, so here's my dagger brush, and in hindsight, I don't know if I would use this brush again. I was thinking, hey, it's a floppy brush, it's a loose painting, those two things go together, right? And I just don't think I had enough control of it, and a lot of times I had too much water in it, so I wasn't a huge fan of using this dagger brush, but I am going to give it a go in this section of painting. And the first thing that I'm going to do is go in with my Simply Simmons brush and put in some clear water just to create some lines of feathers that are going in the same direction as the lines of feathers on the reference photo. So I'm putting in my clear water. And I'm using some phthalo blue on the back of the rooster's neck, and then I have ultramarine blue with the neck stroke. So I'm varying my strokes with different colors and just making sure that I'm painting those feathers in the same direction that's in the reference photo. And I don't want to get too picky in this area because it's not an area of interest. So I'm just keeping it simple, and I'm just trying to get in the basic direction of the feathers. Also, I'm creating some dimensionality to his neck because the back of his neck is in shadow and the front has more light hitting it, and that makes it more three-dimensional looking. So the darkest brush strokes I kept on the back of his neck, and then as I come around to the front of him, I make them lighter. And I'm just carefully looking at my reference photo frequently to make sure that I'm getting the direction of the feathers, because they kind of curve and they wave here and there. And I just want to get the basic idea of how they look into my painting. And it doesn't have to be exact. And for me, I had to keep in mind, I had to paint this painting a lot more exact than you guys will have to. You can paint this a lot looser and have more of your own interpretation to how it looks, because you're not painting it for a client. So I had to be a little bit more careful than you guys will have to be. So if you get a feather here or a feather there wrong, don't worry about that. The point of the painting is to create a beautiful painting that hangs well together, and you do not have the same restrictions on you as I had, because this painting will be going to a client. So you can have a little bit more fun with it. But I did keep this area pretty loose. And I'm just painting in some of those dark under feathers now, doing a lot of negative painting between the feathers. And there's a lot of triangle shapes that are between the feathers, so I'm looking at those. So look at your negative shapes too and paint the negative shapes around the lighter feathers. Also, when I'm painting in these feathers, you will see that I'm using light tea consistency in some areas, and then I go back in with a lot darker paint. And a lot of these feathers in this area I painted with mostly ultramarine blue, maybe a little Winsor violet. When you do your painting, you can mix it up a little bit more and add maybe a little bit of lamp black even, I think would be pretty. And I'm just going in with some dark ultramarine blue to get in some variety of values there, and also to create depth, because feathers lay on top of feathers and there's shadows created by some of the top feathers create shadows on the feathers beneath them. So I'm doing that. And what looks best, I think, is to put in the dark shadow, and while it's still wet, go in with clear water and draw that shadow down, like I'm doing right here. So you can get that dark area in, but to help it stay loose, go back in with clear water after you get that dark area in and paint into that dark area with a little bit of clear water, just to draw that dark down so it's not a harsh edged dark. And you can see right here what I did was I put in some very light tea consistency along the edge of his neck, and then I painted into that with a watery brush just to kind of attach all that to the background. And that was phthalo blue that I put on his upper chest area there. And you can see I'm going back in and touching it with clear water to draw that area into the background, just to make kind of a loose edge in this area where it's not really an important line. So that is a perfect place to create your lost edges. And just remember, with each brush stroke or every other brush stroke, try to change the color of paint a little bit, at least in your paintbrush, so you keep the colors dynamic, and you want them to be the same value. You just want them a little bit different hue. And I'm going in again along the top of the bird and darkening some of those feather areas to continue to build up some dimension by having a darker area on one side of the bird where the light is not hitting him. And I'm using my rigger brush and about a tea to milk consistency amount of ultramarine blue and Winsor violet in my brush. And you can vary your colors more than I did. I was painting more closely to the original reference photo. And here I'm picking up some Winsor violet out of my palette, mixing it around a little bit on my brush. And that's one thing that is something that's important for those of you who are more of a beginner, just how to use your brush and your palette. When you go in and you put some paint on your brush, you might dip it into the paint on your palette, but then what you usually want to do is go into the flat area of your palette and just kind of scrub it around into your brush bristles so it gets evenly distributed throughout your brush. So that's just something to think about, especially if you're working with wet paint that's not dried on your palette like mine is. My paint is all dried in my palette wells. And one of the reasons that I do that is if you're working with paint directly out of the tube while it's still goopy, then you're going to get blobs of paint on your paintbrush, and you're going to need to scrub your brush around a lot more in the palette to kind of even the paint out in your paintbrush so you don't get globs on your brush. Another thing that you can do is, as you paint these feathers and you get these little lines in and maybe they're starting to look a little bit stiff, go back in over them while they're still a little bit wet with clear water and just brush through the feathers with clear water and just kind of loosen them up and let some of them merge together and some of them won't merge together, but that'll just help loosen up your whole painting. You can spray it, or you can also go in with a brush with clear water in it, like I said, and brush through some of your lines and your brush strokes just to kind of loosen up the whole thing. All right, so that area of negative space that I wanted to play up, it dried lighter than I wanted it to. So I'm going to go back into that area now with a little bit of ultramarine blue, probably about milk consistency. And I'm just going to add more color in that area because I want to really emphasize that pretty V shape between his tail and his body. So I'm going in to punch that up a little bit. And also that white area that goes over the curve of the top of his tail, I thought it was a pretty effect for that to be a soft white area, but also a white area that is not in the reference photo, but it looks like light hitting his tail. And so I left that in my painting, even though it's not in the reference photo, because I just think it's a nice contrast between the dark part of that, the upper part of the tail, and that white area. I liked how that looked, so I left it. It looks like light bouncing off the top of his tail, and I kept that edge soft between the dark tail and the white. And then the background has a soft edge with it too. And I just really like how that area turned out. Next, I'm going to get some darker paints in my brush and work on the dark feathers that are underneath the bird. And I just think these dark feathers help delineate where the bird is in space. So I did go ahead and make them dark. And I'm doing negative painting around those white feathers that come down over his bottom area right behind his back leg. And I'm painting this area fairly dark just to kind of show where that edge of the bird is. Under the bird, I'm using a mix of ultramarine blue and Winsor violet. And again, as you can see, I'm doing some negative painting around those bottom white feathers. And what I'm basically doing right now is painting his upper leg with the Winsor violet and ultramarine blue together. And while I'm doing that little area, I'm also going up higher into the bird to kind of connect that very dark spot to the rest of the feathers above it. So you'll see me now, I've got fairly clear water in my brush, so I'm drawing out some of that milk consistency paint into my area of clear water or very light tea consistency, just so that it's all not just a flat dark color. You have some lighter passages and some darker passages to describe the same area. And I also put a little dab of phthalo blue in that pool right above his leg there, just to keep that little pool of that little shape of color interesting. Okay, you guys, I hope you enjoyed session 2 of the rooster painting. I certainly did. The tail was my favorite part to paint, and I had a lot of fun with it. And in the next session, we will continue to soften some of the feathers with a scrubber brush and use some gouache to add some really nice feather textures. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
I love you.